Here's something most gardeners get completely backwards. They assume the fruit trees they actually want, the ones they've been eyeing at the garden center for years, need an orchard's worth of space to ever produce anything. Cherries, pears, even avocados. Most people write them off before they even try, convinced a small patio or a modest deck simply isn't enough. It isn't true, and by the end of this video, you're going to see exactly why. Today we're counting down 10 fruit trees that homeowners genuinely want to grow. The kind of trees people are already searching for and asking about in gardening groups, but very few realize can actually thrive in a pot. This isn't a list of obscure novelties nobody's heard of. These are trees you already know, trees you've probably eaten the fruit from 100 times, and in a moment, you're going to learn that almost all of them have a compact side you never knew existed. Stay with me all the way to the top of the list, because the tree waiting for you at number 1 is the one most gardeners assume is completely off limits for container growing, and it might just be the single most requested fruit tree in patio gardening communities right now. There's a reason container fruit gardening has exploded in popularity over the past several years, and it's not just about small yards. Even gardeners with plenty of ground are choosing pots on purpose, because a container hands you complete control over soil, drainage, and sun exposure in a way in-ground planting never can. If a tree struggles in one spot, you move it. If your soil is heavy clay or fast-draining sand, it doesn't matter, because the tree never has to touch it. And for a huge number of these trees, cold climates stop being a deal-breaker entirely, since you can simply bring the pot indoors or into a garage for winter protection. Picture this for a second. It's a warm morning, you've got a coffee in hand, and instead of driving to the store for fruit, you step onto your own patio and pick it warm off the branch. That's not a distant fantasy for the trees on this list. It's a realistic first season, and it's exactly the kind of moment that makes container fruit gardening so addictive once you start. Before we jump into the countdown, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you catch the rest of this series. Drop a comment too, right now, telling me which climate you're gardening in, because it genuinely helps me pick which trees to cover next. All right, let's get into it. Starting at number 10, and pay attention, because there's a detail with almost every tree here that most first-time growers get wrong. Number 10 is the dwarf pear tree, and this one surprises people constantly, because pears carry this old-fashioned image of enormous, decades-old trees towering over a farmhouse. Modern dwarf pear varieties, grafted onto compact rootstock, completely upend that idea, staying under 8 feet while still producing full-sized, classic pears. For a mature dwarf pear, look for a container in the 20 to 25 gallon range, about 20 inches across. Give it full sun, at least 6 hours daily, and water deeply whenever the top couple of inches of soil dry out. Fertilize in early spring, and again lightly after harvest, with a balanced fruit tree formula. Dwarf pears are impressively cold-hardy, typically thriving in zones 4 through 8, which makes them one of the more forgiving trees on this list for colder climates. Here's an important detail many people miss. Most pear varieties need a second, compatible variety nearby for good pollination, so a single tree often disappoints, unless you've chosen a rare self-fertile cultivar. Harvest generally arrives in late summer through early fall, and one thing that surprises new growers is that pears actually ripen best off the tree, picked while still firm and finished indoors at room temperature, rather than left to soften on the branch. The most common mistake is waiting for pears to soften before picking, which usually results in mealy, overripe fruit at the core. Homeowners love dwarf pears because the trees produce heavily even while small, and there's something deeply satisfying about setting out a bowl of pears you grew yourself from what still looks like an oversized houseplant on your porch. There's something quietly satisfying about that first bowl of fruit, watching a tree you've fussed over for months finally hand something back to you. It's a feeling a lot of longtime gardeners say they didn't expect the first time it happened to them. That's a solid opener, but the next tree on this list might be the single most requested fruit tree in every backyard gardening group online. And once you hear why it works in a pot, you'll understand the appeal instantly. At number 9, we have the dwarf cherry tree. And if you've spent any time in gardening forums, you already know how often this exact question comes up. Can I actually grow cherries in a pot? The answer is yes, thanks to genetically dwarf varieties like Stella and compact lapins, which stay in the 6 to 8 foot range without any special pruning tricks required. A mature dwarf cherry does well in a 20 to 25 gallon container, roughly 20 inches in diameter. These trees want full sun and soil that drains well but doesn't dry out completely between waterings. Fertilize in early spring with a balanced formula. Most dwarf sweet cherries are hardy in zones 5 through 9, while dwarf sour cherry varieties push that range even further into colder territory. Pollination matters here, so check carefully, since some dwarf cherries are self-fertile, while others need a second compatible variety nearby. Harvest typically lands in early to midsummer. You might be surprised to learn how fast birds will find a fruiting cherry tree, often within days of the fruit starting to blush, so lightweight netting becomes essential once color starts to show. The most common mistake is underwatering during the weeks when the cherries are sizing up, which leads to smaller, less juicy fruit. Homeowners love this tree because homegrown cherries feel like a genuine indulgence, and there's a particular kind of pride in handing a neighbor a bowl of cherries and watching their face when you tell them it came from a pot on your patio. If cherries have you convinced, the next tree ripens even earlier, rewarding your patience before summer has really even settled in. Number 8 is the dwarf plum, and specifically, I want to point you toward genetically compact varieties bred for patio growing rather than simply pruned down standard trees. Plums have quietly become one of the most popular container fruit trees at garden centers over the last several years, driven largely by how spectacular the spring blossom display is on its own. A 20 to 25 gallon container suits a mature dwarf plum well. Give it full sun and soil that drains freely without drying out entirely between waterings. Fertilize in early spring and lightly again after harvest, since too much nitrogen pushes leafy growth at the expense of fruit. Dwarf plums are generally hardy in zones 5 through 9. Here's a detail that trips people up. Pollination needs vary a lot by type, with many European plum varieties being self-fertile, while several popular Japanese plum types need a second tree nearby to produce well. Harvest usually arrives in mid to late summer. The most common mistake is overfeeding, which sounds counterintuitive, but excess fertilizer genuinely reduces fruit quality on plums more than it helps. Homeowners love dwarf plums because the fruit is dramatically juicier than anything picked underripe for grocery store shelves, and the tree earns its space in spring alone, with a blossom show that rivals ornamental flowering trees, the kind of thing that stops neighbors mid-walk to ask what it is. Now we're getting into some genuinely exceptional container fruit trees, starting with one that ripens earliest of all, often before most of your other trees have even finished blooming. At number 7, we have the dwarf apricot, and this tree has a reputation for being a little temperamental, mostly because it flowers so early in spring that a late frost can sometimes damage the blossoms. In a container, though, you actually have the advantage, since you can simply wheel the pot into a garage or up against a sheltered wall for a night or two whenever frost threatens. A 20-gallon container works well for a mature dwarf apricot, around 18 to 20 inches across. It wants full sun and water whenever the top inch or two of soil dries out. Fertilize in early spring with a balanced fruit tree formula. Dwarf apricots are typically hardy in zones 5 through 9, and most varieties are self-fertile, so a single tree produces fruit without a partner. Harvest generally lands in early summer, often the earliest stone fruit of the season. Most gardeners never realize how drought-tolerant apricots actually are once established, making them more forgiving than people expect if you occasionally miss a watering. The most common mistake is placing the tree somewhere with morning shade, since apricots specifically benefit from sun that dries the leaves quickly and reduces disease. Homeowners love dwarf apricots because a fully ripe, homegrown apricot bears almost no resemblance to the mealy, underripe ones typically found at the store, and that first bite tends to catch people completely off guard. The next tree solves a problem a lot of gardeners assume they can't solve at all, growing real citrus somewhere that actually gets cold in winter. Number 6 is the Satsuma mandarin. And if you've ever peeled one of these easy, seedless little oranges from a grocery bin in winter, you already understand the appeal. Satsumas are naturally more cold-hardy than most citrus, and dwarf varieties on compact rootstock make them genuinely well-matched to pot culture. A 15 to 20-gallon container handles a mature dwarf Satsuma nicely. Full sun is essential, along with consistent watering whenever the top inch of soil dries out. Fertilize monthly during the growing season with a citrus-specific formula. Satsumas are hardy in zones 8 through 11 outdoors, more cold-tolerant than lemons or limes, though container growers farther north still bring them in for winter. They're self-fertile. Harvest typically runs from late fall into winter. There's an important detail many people miss. Satsuma peels are famously loose and easy to remove, wonderful for eating, but meaning the fruit bruises more easily than other citrus, so gentle handling after picking matters. The most common mistake is judging ripeness by color alone, since Satsumas can look fully orange before they're actually sweet. Homeowners love this tree because it's essentially seedless, easy to peel, and one of the most universally loved fruits you can hand a picky kid or a picky adult straight off the branch on a cold winter morning. If a mandarin tree in a cold climate surprised you, the next one might surprise you even more because it brings a completely different kind of citrus intensity to the list. At number 5, we have the key lime, and this tree earns its spot because of how dramatically it rewards a little attention. Key limes are naturally compact, flower prolifically, and produce fruit with an intensity most people have never tasted from a supermarket lime. A 10 to 15 gallon container works well for a mature key lime, kept to 4 or 6 feet, with occasional pruning. These trees want maximum sun, ideally 8 hours, and soil kept consistently moist without ever sitting in standing water. Feed monthly during the growing season with citrus fertilizer. Key limes are hardy outdoors only in zones 9 through 11, making them one of the more tender trees here, so colder climates require bringing them indoors for winter. They're self-fertile. Harvest can happen through much of the year in warm climates, though the heaviest flush tends to arrive in summer and fall. One detail many people miss is that key lime branches often carry noticeable thorns, so a bit of caution during pruning and picking goes a long way. The most common mistake is exposing the tree to any frost at all, since key limes are considerably less cold-hardy than lemons. Homeowners love key limes because there's no substitute for fresh key lime juice, and one healthy tree tends to produce more limes than most households know what to do with come pie season. Even if all you've got is a balcony or a modest patch of concrete, it's worth pausing here to remember that none of this requires acreage. Just a sunny corner, a good pot, and a little patience. We're halfway up the list now, and the next tree might be the biggest surprise yet, because almost nobody thinks to grow it at home at all. Number 4 is the olive tree, and this might be the biggest surprise so far on this list, because most people simply never consider growing one at home, let alone in a pot. Dwarf and naturally compact olive varieties have become genuinely popular in container gardening over the last several years, prized as much for their silvery, sculptural foliage as for the fruit itself. A 15 to 25 gallon container suits a mature container olive well, and honestly, olives tolerate being somewhat root-bound better than most fruit trees. They want as much sun as you can give them, and are remarkably drought-tolerant once established, so allowing the soil to dry out noticeably between waterings actually suits them better than keeping it consistently moist. Fertilize lightly in spring. Olives are hardy in zones 8 through 11 outdoors, and container growers in colder climates bring them into a cool, bright space for winter, since olives actually need a period of cool temperatures to flower well the following year. Most olive varieties benefit from a second variety nearby for reliable fruit set, though some are partially self-fertile. Harvest generally arrives in fall, and here's what surprises almost everyone. Olives picked straight off the tree are intensely bitter and completely inedible until cured, a process involving brining or lye treatment that takes days to weeks depending on the method. The most common mistake is assuming a container olive is purely ornamental and never fruiting it seriously, when a well-sited container olive genuinely produces a usable harvest. Homeowners love this tree because it brings an unmistakable Mediterranean elegance to a patio, and there's something almost bragging rights worthy about curing your own olives from a tree that lives in a pot by your front door. We're closing in on the top 3 now, and this next tree puts on one of the most dramatic seasonal displays of anything on this list. At number 3, we have the persimmon, specifically compact Asian persimmon varieties that stay well under 10 feet and adapt beautifully to large containers. Persimmons carry a slightly old-fashioned orchard-only reputation, But modern dwarf cultivars have made them far more practical for patios than most people assume. A mature dwarf persimmon does best in a 20 to 25-gallon container, around 20 inches across. It wants full sun and moderate, consistent watering, drying slightly between sessions but never bone dry. Fertilize in early spring with a balanced formula. Persimmons are generally hardy in zones 7 through 10, with some varieties tolerating even colder conditions. Most Asian persimmon varieties are self-fertile, which makes them refreshingly simple compared to several other trees on this list. Harvest generally runs from October into November, often after the leaves have already dropped, creating a striking visual of bright orange fruit hanging on bare branches, the kind of thing that makes a patio look like something out of a painting. The most common mistake is picking astringent varieties too early, which taste unpleasantly bitter until fully soft and ripe, while non-astringent varieties can be eaten while still firm. Homeowners love persimmons because the tree puts on a genuinely dramatic autumn show, and the fruit itself has a rich, honeyed flavor that most people have only ever encountered dried, never fresh from the branch. A lot of gardeners tell me that growing fruit in containers ended up giving them more than just something to eat. It became a small daily ritual, checking on the tree, noticing new growth, feeling a little more connected to the seasons than they had in years. Number 2 is the one true wild card on this entire list, and I've included it on purpose because it's rapidly gaining a following in backyard gardening communities and deserves far more attention than it currently gets. Number 2 is the jujube, sometimes called the Chinese date, and once people discover it, they tend to become mildly obsessed. The fruit has a texture surprisingly similar to a crisp apple when fresh, sweetening and wrinkling like a date as it dries on the tree, which means you get two completely different eating experiences from the same fruit, depending on when you pick it. A 20-gallon container suits a mature dwarf jujube well. It wants full sun and is remarkably drought-tolerant once established, one of the most low-maintenance trees on this entire list when it comes to watering. Fertilize lightly in spring. Jujubes are surprisingly cold-hardy, thriving in zones 6 through 9, and they shrug off heat and poor soil better than almost any other fruit tree here. Most varieties benefit from a second tree nearby for the best fruit set. Harvest typically arrives in late summer through fall. What surprises people most is how little care this tree demands compared to everything else on the list, tolerating drought, heat, and even some neglect while still producing reliably. The most common mistake is simply never trying it, since so few gardeners have even heard of jujube, despite it being one of the easiest fruit trees to grow in a container. Homeowners who discover it love introducing it to guests, mostly because almost nobody recognizes the fruit, and the reaction is always the same: pleasant surprise. And here we are, at number 1, the tree you've been waiting for since the very beginning of this video, the one most gardeners are absolutely convinced cannot be grown in a pot at all. The container avocado takes the top spot, and it earns that spot honestly. It's the most demanding tree on this list, no question, but it's also the one generating the most excitement in gardening communities right now, thanks to dwarf-grafted varieties like Little Cato and Wurtz that have made it genuinely achievable for the first time. This is the tree that turns a container garden into a genuine conversation piece, the one guests point at and ask about the moment they see it. You'll want a large container for this one, 25 gallons at minimum, and larger as the tree matures, with excellent drainage, since avocado roots are notoriously sensitive to sitting in wet soil. Full sun is essential, along with deep, infrequent watering that allows the top few inches of soil to dry between sessions. Fertilize during the growing season with a formula low in salts, since avocados are sensitive to salt buildup in container soil over time. Dwarf avocados are hardy outdoors only in zones 9 through 11, and container growers in colder climates bring them indoors near the brightest window for winter, though fruiting reliably indoors long-term remains difficult. Pollination is genuinely fascinating here, since avocado flowers open as female in the morning and male in the afternoon on a staggered schedule, so a second, complementary tree often improves fruit set considerably. Harvest can take several years from planting, often 3 to 5, and here's the detail that surprises everyone without exception. Avocados never ripen on the tree. You pick them mature but hard, then let them soften on the counter over several days, exactly the way store-bought avocados work. The most common mistake is impatience. giving up on the tree before it's had a real chance to mature and flower. Homeowners who succeed with a container avocado talk about it like a genuine milestone, because slicing into guacamole made from fruit you grew yourself, in a pot, on a patio, is one of the most quietly satisfying moments in all of home gardening. It's the tree that proves the entire premise of this list. If you can grow this in a pot, you can grow almost anything on it. So there's the list, 10 fruit trees that most gardeners already want, several of which come with a compact secret most people never knew existed. If you're feeling inspired, resist the urge to buy all 10 this weekend. Pick the one or two that excited you most while watching, and give them your full attention this season. Real success with one tree teaches you more than a scattered attempt at everything at once, and there's nothing quite like standing on your own patio next summer, fruit in hand, knowing you grew it yourself in a pot most people would never expect to hold anything more than a houseplant. And picture that first harvest for a moment, sharing it with family, a neighbor, or a friend who never believed you could grow real fruit in a pot. That moment alone tends to make every bit of the effort worth it. If this video showed you a tree you didn't realize was possible in a pot, do me a favor and give it a like, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one, because we've got more of these container growing guides coming soon. Drop a comment and let me know which tree on this list you're most excited to try, or if there's one you're already growing that deserves its own video. I read every single one and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. And if you found this useful, share it with someone who's ever said they don't have room to grow their own fruit, because chances are they do. Picture it for a moment. A quiet weekend morning, a few containers arranged near your back door, and you, stepping outside to pick something ripe and sweet from a tree most people never expect to see growing at home. That's not a fantasy. With the right choice and a little patience, that's simply next season, waiting for you to begin.